The wind swept gently across the rolling Montana hills, carrying the crisp scent of pine and earth. The sun had barely begun its descent, casting long, golden shadows over the quiet countryside. Daniel Carter stood at the edge of his modest ranch, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn flannel jacket, watching the sky change color. The days were getting shorter now, and the evenings brought a cold that settled deep into his bones. He had always preferred this kind of solitude. The world had been loud for too long: gunfire, radio static, the heavy thud of combat boots on dry soil. Now, there was only the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional whinny of a horse from the barn. It had been 5 years since he left the war behind, but some nights, it still felt as if he had never truly returned. At 47, Daniel was a man who carried the weight of time on his shoulders. His once jet-black hair had begun to silver at the temples, and the creases around his steel-blue eyes told stories he rarely shared. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built like a man who had spent his life working with his hands. The ranch, inherited from his grandfather, was both a refuge and a prison. It kept him away from the world but left him alone with his memories. The people in town knew him, but not well. He was polite, but distant. He'd show up at the local feed store or stop by the gas station for coffee, exchanging brief nods and short conversations, but never lingering. Some understood, small towns had their share of men like Daniel, men who had been through too much and spoke too little. That day, like most days, had been predictable. He had spent the morning tending to the horses, fixing a broken fence post, and chopping firewood. By late afternoon, he found himself staring at the horizon again, as if waiting for something, though he couldn't say what. And that was when he saw it, the dog. It was just a shape at first, a dark silhouette against the dry grass at the far edge of his property. It moved slowly, cautiously, stopping every few steps as if unsure whether to continue forward. The setting sun caught the dull sheen of its fur, black and tan, matted in places, ribs faintly visible beneath its frame. A stray. Daniel narrowed his eyes, watching. He had seen strays before, usually dogs that wandered too far from town or had been left behind by careless owners. Most of them never got this close. Something about this one was different. The dog paused, lifting its head slightly, as if it could sense that it was being watched. For a long moment, man and animal held each other's gaze. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the dog turned and disappeared into the brush. Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Just a stray. He told himself he didn't care. He wasn't looking for company. But something about the way the dog had looked at him, the hesitation, the quiet understanding, lingered in his mind longer than he expected. As he turned back toward the house, the cold settling in for the night, Daniel had no way of knowing that this was only the beginning. The next morning, Daniel woke to the familiar sounds of his routine, the distant neighing of the horses, the creak of the wind against the old barn, the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the kitchen. He brewed his coffee in silence, the rich aroma filling the small cabin. His body moved through the motions automatically, coffee first, then boots on, then out to feed the animals. He was halfway through scattering hay when he noticed movement near the tree line. The dog. It was back. Daniel straightened, gripping the metal bucket a little tighter. The dog lingered near the edge of the property, still keeping its distance. In the daylight, Daniel could see it more clearly, lean, ribs showing slightly under its dull coat. It was a German Shepherd mix, its black and tan fur tangled with burrs, its tail hanging low in uncertainty. He sighed. Strays never lasted long out here. The winters were unforgiving, and coyotes roamed at night. The dog had probably been dumped by someone who didn't want the responsibility. Daniel turned back to his work, deliberately ignoring the animal. If it was smart, it would move on. But as he walked to the barn, the soft sound of cautious footsteps followed him. He glanced back. The dog had crept a little closer, still keeping several yards between them. Its dark eyes held a quiet intelligence, watching his every move. Not desperate, not aggressive. Just waiting. Daniel set the bucket down with a sigh. "You're stubborn, huh?" His voice was rough from disuse, but the dog's ears perked slightly at the sound. He reached into the bucket and pulled out a handful of dry oats. Slowly, he tossed a few toward the dog. The animal flinched but didn't run. Instead, it lowered its head, sniffing the ground where the oats had landed. Then, just as cautiously, it licked up a few pieces. Daniel chuckled to himself. Not exactly steak, huh? He didn't expect an answer, but for the first time, the dog's tail gave the smallest flick, just once, before it returned to its cautious stance. Daniel stood there a moment longer before shaking his head. He wasn't in the habit of feeding strays. He wasn't in the habit of needing anyone at all. Still, as he walked back toward the house, the dog didn't leave. That evening, after finishing his chores, Daniel stepped onto his porch with a beer in hand. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, washing the land in amber light. The air smelled of pine and cooling earth. And there, at the edge of the property, the dog lay curled in the grass. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "This ain't your home, buddy," he muttered to himself. But when he went inside, he left the porch door open just a crack. The next few days followed the same pattern. The dog kept its distance but never left. It watched Daniel from a few yards away, never getting too close, never making a sound. It was patient. And Daniel, despite himself, found that he didn't mind the company. He started tossing scraps in the dog's direction. Just small things. A piece of dry bread. The last bite of his sandwich. It never begged, never whined, just accepted whatever was given and ate in silence. One evening, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, rain hammering against the roof in sheets. Daniel sat in his living room, a book open in his lap, but he wasn't reading. Outside, through the window, he could see a shadow huddled under the porch steps. For a long moment, he debated with himself. Then he sighed, pushed himself to his feet, and opened the door. The dog lifted its head. Rain dripped from its fur, its eyes wary. Daniel took a step back, leaving the door open. "Well," he muttered. The dog hesitated, then slowly rose to its feet. It stepped forward, cautiously, its paws leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. Inside, it stopped, standing in the middle of the room, dripping water everywhere. Daniel shut the door. "Guess that makes two of us," he murmured. He grabbed an old towel and tossed it toward the dog. It flinched but didn't run. Then, as if testing some invisible boundary, it slowly circled the room before curling up near the fireplace. Daniel watched in silence. The house, which had always felt a little too empty, didn't feel so hollow anymore. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. The next morning, Daniel woke to the unfamiliar sound of soft breathing. For a brief moment, his body tensed, instincts kicking in before he remembered the dog. He turned his head and saw it curled up near the fireplace, its body rising and falling with slow, even breaths. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful for a stray that had spent who knew how long surviving on its own. Daniel sat up in his chair, stretching out his stiff limbs. The dog's ears twitched at the movement, but it didn't wake. He studied it for a moment. The black antan fur was still tangled and matted, its ribs still slightly visible beneath its coat. But here, inside, in the warmth of the cabin, it looked at ease. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. He hadn't planned on keeping the mutt. But somehow, it felt like the mutt had already decided for him. Over the next few days, the silent understanding between them grew. The dog never asked for anything. It didn't beg, didn't whine, didn't push itself on him. It simply existed in Daniel's space, watching him work, following at a careful distance. Daniel started leaving out small portions of food, not much, just enough for the dog to eat without feeling like it was being given a handout. It never devoured the food like a starving animal. Instead, it ate carefully, deliberately, as if trying to prove something. One morning, as Daniel drank his coffee on the porch, he glanced down and saw the dog sitting just a few feet away, watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. He huffed a quiet laugh. "You need a name." The dog perked its ears slightly but remained still. Daniel took another sip of his coffee. He wasn't one for sentimentality, but something about the way the dog lingered just out of reach, always in the shadows, made the name come easy. "Shadow," he muttered. The dog's ears twitched, its head tilting slightly as if considering the name. Then, to Daniel's surprise, its tail gave the smallest flick. Daniel smiled to himself. "Guess that'll do." The first sign of trust came in small moments. One evening, as Daniel sat on the couch, reading an old novel, he felt a sudden weight press against his leg. He looked down and found Shadow standing beside him, cautiously resting his head against Daniel's knee. It was tentative, almost as if the dog was asking permission. Daniel hesitated, then slowly reached out. He expected Shadow to flinch, to pull away, but instead, the dog leaned in just a little more. Daniel ran his calloused fingers through the thick fur, feeling the subtle scars hidden beneath. "Someone wasn't too kind to you, huh?" he murmured. Shadow didn't move, just closed his eyes and sighed, as if he had been waiting for this touch for a long time. The first real test came a week later. Daniel had driven into town for supplies, leaving Shadow behind. The dog had never tried to step inside the truck, never acted as if it wanted to leave. But when Daniel returned home, he found Shadow sitting on the porch, panting, eyes full of worry. At first, he didn't think much of it. But as soon as Daniel stepped out of the truck, Shadow bolted toward him, pressing his body against Daniel's legs, sniffing him, nudging his hands. For a moment, Daniel just stood there, startled. Then he understood. Shadow had thought he wasn't coming back. Something deep inside Daniel shifted at that realization. He reached down, resting a hand on Shadow's head. "I ain't leaving, buddy." Shadow's tail wagged, just once. It was enough. The nightmares came that night. They always did, though less frequently these days. Daniel was back in Afghanistan, the heat pressing against his skin, the weight of his gear heavy on his back. The sounds of gunfire and shouting filled the air, drowning out everything else. He saw faces he had lost, heard the echoes of their voices calling out to him. The suffocating feeling of helplessness crashed over him like a wave. Then, a sharp, wet nose pressed against his arm. Daniel gasped awake, his body drenched in sweat. His breathing was ragged, his hands clenched into fists. Shadow was there, standing beside the bed, eyes fixed on him. The dog nudged him again, this time with more force. Daniel exhaled shakily, running a hand down his face. He reached out, resting his palm on Shadow's back, grounding himself in the warmth beneath his fingers. He had spent so many nights alone in the quiet, trapped in the past. But tonight, he wasn't alone. And that made all the difference. Their bond grew stronger after that. Daniel started taking Shadow with him everywhere, to the barn, to the fields, even on his trips into town. People took notice. Tom Higgins, the old rancher, smirked as Daniel walked into the feed store with Shadow trotting at his heels. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom chuckled. "Didn't think I'd ever see the day you took in a stray." Daniel scoffed, patting Shadow's side. "Guess he took me in first." Tom grinned. "That's how the best ones find us." The final moment of trust came one afternoon. Daniel was out near the pasture, working on a broken fence. He set his tools down for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow. When he looked up, he saw a shadow running toward him, fast. Daniel frowned. The dog never ran like that unless... Then he heard it. The low growl. A coyote had slipped through the trees, its yellow eyes locked on Daniel. Shadow placed himself between them, hackles raised, teeth bared in a silent warning. Daniel had no doubt, if the coyote came any closer, Shadow would fight. But the coyote hesitated, eyeing the large German shepherd. After a tense moment, it turned and slinked back into the woods. Daniel let out a slow breath. He looked down at Shadow, who still stood firm, his body tense. Daniel reached out, resting a hand on the dog's head. "Good boy." Shadow turned his gaze up to him, and for the first time since they met, Daniel saw it, absolute trust. The stray had found his place. And Daniel? For the first time in years, he wasn't lost anymore. The morning started like any other. The air was crisp, the frost still clinging to the edges of the wooden fence posts as the sun stretched its way over the Montana hills. Daniel pulled on his old work jacket, stepping onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee in hand. Shadow was already there, sitting at his usual spot near the steps, ears perked, eyes scanning the land. It had become their routine, Daniel waking up to find the dog already awake, watching over the ranch like a silent guardian. But something about the way Shadow sat that morning was different. His muscles were tense, his ears shifting at the slightest sound. "You hear something?" Daniel asked, lowering his mug. Shadow didn't move at first. Then, as if answering, he let out a deep, low growl, not loud, but enough for Daniel to take notice. He set his coffee down. "Easy, boy." The dog wasn't growling at the land. He was looking toward the driveway. Daniel followed his gaze, squinting against the morning light. A dust cloud rose from the dirt road leading into town. A vehicle was coming. Daniel wasn't expecting visitors. A black truck pulled up, the engine humming as it idled in front of the house. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man with a familiar face Daniel hadn't seen in years. Luke Tanner. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He hadn't thought about Luke in a long time, hadn't needed to. They had served together once, but their paths had diverged long before either of them left the military. Shadow stood rigid beside Daniel, his tail still, his body language cautious but unreadable. Luke shut the truck door and walked forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Been a long time, Carter." Daniel gave a slow nod, his fingers tightening around the railing of the porch. "Didn't expect to see you here." Luke let out a dry chuckle. "Didn't expect to be here. But I heard about you, figured I'd drop by." Daniel didn't say anything, just watched as Luke's eyes flicked toward Shadow. "That your dog?" Daniel hesitated before nodding. "Something like that." Luke smirked. "Looks like a soldier's dog." The words sat heavy between them. Daniel exhaled. "What do you want, Luke?" Luke took another step closer. "I need a favor." Daniel stiffened. "I'm not in that business anymore." "I'm not asking you to fight," Luke said. "Just to remember." The silence stretched between them. Then Luke reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. He held it out. Daniel didn't want to look, but his hands moved before he could stop himself. It was an old deployment photo, one Daniel recognized instantly. Afghanistan. Their unit. Faces he hadn't seen in years, some of them gone now, lost to time and war. But it wasn't the picture itself that made Daniel's stomach turn. It was the dog in the background. A black and tan German shepherd. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He looked down at Shadow, then back at the photo. It couldn't be. "You remember him, don't you?" Luke's voice was quiet now. Daniel swallowed hard. "Yes. he remembered. Shadow had been a war dog. Daniel had seen him before, different name, different handler. He had been one of the best in their unit, trained for tracking, protection, bomb detection. But when his handler had died in an ambush, the military had deemed him unstable, unfit for reassignment. Dogs like him didn't get second chances. Daniel had heard rumors that some military dogs were abandoned, sold off, or worse. He had never known exactly what happened to this one, until now. He was supposed to be put down, Luke said, watching Daniel's face. But someone smuggled him out. Got him into a transport heading stateside. And then, well, looks like he found you. Daniel clenched his jaw. He felt sick. All this time, Shadow hadn't just been a stray. He had been lost. The weight of it settled on Daniel that night. He sat on the porch, Shadow lying beside him, staring out at the land in quiet companionship. Daniel reached down, running a hand through the dog's fur. "You were one of us," he murmured. Shadow didn't react at first. Then, slowly, his tail gave a single thump against the wood. Daniel exhaled. All these years, both of them had been wandering, carrying scars that never fully healed. He thought about the way Shadow never begged, never pushed for affection. Because he had been trained not to. Because his world had been stripped away from him. Daniel understood. The past had been chasing them both. And now, it had found them. The breaking point came 3 days later. Daniel was walking Shadow through town, their usual routine. The people had grown used to seeing the pair together, the quiet man and his loyal companion. But then, out of nowhere, a loud bang rang through the air. Fireworks. Some kids lighting them off in an alley. The sound cracked like gunfire. And Shadow snapped. Before Daniel could react, the dog lunged, instinct taking over. He wasn't attacking, but his body tensed like a soldier ready for war. His eyes went wild, his breathing sharp, his stance rigid. Daniel grabbed him before he could bolt. "Shadow." "Easy." But Shadow wasn't there anymore. His mind was in the past. Daniel could see it, the war, the noise, the panic, the fear. It was the same look Daniel had seen in the mirror too many times before. And for the first time, he truly understood how broken they both were. People in town stared. A few of them muttered. A woman pulled her child closer. Daniel ignored them all. He crouched low, steadying himself. He didn't yank the leash, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he whispered, just loud enough for Shadow to hear. "You're safe." Shadow's ears flicked. His body trembled. Daniel kept his voice calm. "You're not there anymore. You're here. With me." Shadow's breathing slowed. The tension in his body loosened. And then, finally, his eyes found Daniel's. He let out a long, shaky breath and pressed his head against Daniel's chest. Daniel swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the dog's fur. "It's okay," he murmured. "I got you." The past could chase them. But they weren't running anymore. The morning after Shadow's breakdown in town, Daniel sat on the porch, coffee in hand, staring out at the open fields. The world looked the same, the sky stretched vast and blue, the Montana wind rustled through the tall grass, and the horses grazed lazily by the barn. But something inside Daniel had shifted. He glanced down. Shadow lay at his feet, his body stretched out in the early sunlight. He looked peaceful now, but Daniel knew better. The past still lived inside him, just as it did inside Daniel. They were both survivors of a war that hadn't truly ended. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had spent years convincing himself that he was fine, that he didn't need help, that he didn't need people. But Shadow's reaction in town had shown him something. Healing wasn't about ignoring the past. It was about learning to live with it. And maybe, just maybe, they could learn together. That afternoon, Daniel drove to town with Shadow in the passenger seat. The dog still didn't like the truck, but he tolerated it now, a small victory. As they pulled up to the local veterinary clinic, Shadow stiffened. His ears flicked forward, his body tense. Daniel reached over, resting a hand on his back. "Relax, buddy. We're just here to talk." The bell jingled as Daniel stepped inside. A woman with auburn hair and kind eyes looked up from behind the counter. "Claire Mitchell, the town's veterinarian." "Well, I'll be damned," she said with a smirk. "Daniel Carter finally bringing his dog in for a checkup?" Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Not exactly." She eyed him, then looked down at Shadow. Her expression softened. "You found out, didn't you?" Daniel nodded. "Luke came by." Claire sighed, leaning against the counter. "I tried to track where he came from. Military red tape made it impossible." She studied Shadow, her voice quieter now. "He's not just any war dog, Daniel. He was one of the best. It's a miracle he's even here." Daniel swallowed hard. He had already known that, but hearing it out loud made it real. Claire gestured toward a back room. "Come on. I want to show you something." Inside, Claire pulled out a dusty file from her cabinet. She flipped it open, revealing old military records, faded photographs, and notes scrawled in neat handwriting. She tapped one of the photos, a black and white shot of a German shepherd sitting beside a soldier in uniform. Daniel's throat tightened. "That was Shadow's handler," Claire said softly. "His name was Sergeant Mark Evans." Daniel swallowed. He had known Mark. Good man. Had saved lives, including Daniel's. Claire continued. "After Mark was killed, Shadow refused to leave his body. The reports say he wouldn't eat, wouldn't move. They called it combat stress. Said he was too unstable to be rehomed." She shook her head. "But we both know that's not true. He was grieving." Daniel looked down at Shadow, who sat patiently beside him. The dog had never forgotten his past. And neither had Daniel. That night, as they sat by the fire, Daniel made a decision. Healing wasn't something you did alone. He ran his hand down Shadow's back, feeling the strong muscles beneath the thick coat. "You want to work again, boy?" he murmured. Shadow tilted his head. Daniel smirked. "Not like before. Something different." Shadow didn't understand the words. But when Daniel scratched behind his ears, he leaned into the touch. For the first time, they were moving forward. The next week, Daniel drove to the local Veterans Center. It was a small building on the edge of town, nothing fancy, just a place where men like him could sit, talk, exist. Daniel had never stepped foot inside before. But today, he wasn't going for himself. As he walked through the doors, Shadow at his side, the room quieted. A few of the older vets nodded in recognition, others watching with curiosity. Daniel wasn't one for speeches. He cleared his throat. "This is Shadow." A man near the back, *** Frank, an ex-Marine missing 2 fingers from a bad deployment, *** grinned. "That's a good-looking shepherd you got there." Daniel nodded. "Yeah. He's got a story." The room was still, waiting. Daniel exhaled. He served. Overseas. Lost his handler. Got abandoned when he came back. Frank's grin faded. The air grew heavier. Daniel glanced down at Shadow, then back at the men. "Thing is, he never forgot what he was trained to do. He watches over me. Keeps me from losing myself." Silence. Then, from the corner of the room, a deep voice. Does he help with the nightmares? Daniel turned. The speaker was Charlie, a Vietnam vet who rarely spoke. The man was weathered, tired, but there was something raw in his eyes. Daniel met his gaze. Yeah. He does. Charlie studied Shadow. Think he could help someone else? Daniel looked down at his dog. Shadow was watching Charlie, head slightly tilted, ears forward, not wary, not fearful, just aware. Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah. I think he could. That was how it started. Daniel didn't plan on training therapy dogs. He didn't plan on becoming part of the community again. But somehow, it happened. Shadow became a symbol at the center. The vets who struggled with PTSD, who couldn't talk to their families, found it easier to talk to a dog. And Daniel? For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting for the past to consume him. He had a purpose. One afternoon, Daniel sat on his porch, watching his shadow lay in the grass, eyes half closed, tail swishing lazily. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows over the land. Daniel took a deep breath. The past was still there. It always would be. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking back. Shadow let out a soft sigh and rested his head on Daniel's boot. And Daniel Carter, for the first time in years, felt at peace. At its heart, The Soldier and the Stray Dog is a story about redemption, healing, and the power of companionship. It teaches us several profound lessons about life, trauma, and second chances. Healing takes time, and no one heals alone. Both Daniel and Shadow were wounded, not just physically but emotionally. They had been abandoned in different ways, one by the system that discarded him after war, the other by a world that no longer needed him. But through trust and patience, they helped each other heal. Their bond proves that no one truly overcomes pain alone. We all need someone to walk the road with us. Our past does not define us. Both man and dog were haunted by their pasts, yet their story shows that we are more than what has happened to us. Shadow was more than just a discarded war dog, just as Daniel was more than a soldier defined by his trauma. They were survivors, and they found new purpose beyond their pain. Broken things can be mended. The world often discards what it no longer sees as useful, whether it's an aging war veteran or a damaged military dog. But this story reminds us that no one is beyond saving. The very things that made Daniel and Shadow feel broken were the things that ultimately brought them together. Purpose gives life meaning. At the beginning of the story, Daniel was merely surviving. He had lost his sense of direction, believing that his usefulness ended when he left the battlefield. But by helping Shadow, and later, by training service dogs for other veterans, he found a new purpose. Sometimes, giving meaning to someone else's life is what gives meaning to our own. Love and loyalty transcend words. Shadow never spoke a word, yet he understood Daniel better than any human ever could. Their bond was built on quiet moments, shared struggles, and unspoken understanding. The story reminds us that sometimes, the strongest connections don't need words. The ones we save often save us. Daniel thought he was rescuing a stray dog. In the end, Shadow rescued him right back. Whether it's a pet, a friend, or a stranger in need, when we extend kindness to others, we often find healing ourselves. This is a story about second chances, about a man and a dog who had both been forgotten by the world but found purpose in each other. It's a reminder that no matter how lost we feel, no matter how heavy the past weighs on us, we are never beyond redemption. And sometimes, when we least expect it, help comes in the form of a loyal companion with a wagging tail and a silent promise, you are not alone.